Keys to the Commonwealth, a podcast where we share the real stories of local community members who are using real estate to build personal wealth, along with tips and tricks from professionals across the industry. And now, your host, Landry Fields.
Welcome back to everybody to another Keys to the Commonwealth episode. Landry Fields here, your insurance guru, newbie property investor, and as we like to do, we like to have a lot of conversations with those in the community here to kind of talk about their stories, how they got into investing, what they're doing, and so forth, so we can hopefully give back to you, the listeners and the audience. And I'm very pleased to announce today that we've got Mr. Daniel Rogers on the show with us. So without further ado, Daniel, appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So like we're going to kind of talk about a couple topics we have not yet discussed on this podcast. One, kind of touching on the idea of managing rentals and portfolios remotely or truly remotely, because you've started doing that a bit, and we'll kind of get into that. But also the part about a term called arbitrage, and some may be familiar with that term, may not be familiar with that term, but we'll kind of talk all about that and what that is, and some of the upsides or downsides of that model of investing as well. So but before we do that, hop back in the DeLorean as we always do, and tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how'd you get into the itch to do real estate to begin with?
First off, I love the DeLorean reference. That's one of my favorite movies was Back to the Future growing up. So
I have to say, I don't think I've ever said this, but I did rip it off another podcast that's only purely an insurance podcast specific, so I don't think anyone in our listening audience would ever find it in that respect. But got to give a shout out to that podcast for that. But yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, and so in that respect, going back a little time to when I was growing up, I've always,
You're from Richmond, right?
I'm from Richmond, Kentucky.
Okay.
My name's Daniel Rogers.
Yep.
By the way, for those of you who don't know me. And all my social media is at Short Stay CPA. Okay. So that's what I'm going by now.
I don't think you had. I didn't know you had a social media handle there. So it's good to know.
Yeah. Okay. And so going back, grew up in Richmond, Kentucky. I've always kind of been creative growing up. I liked as a kid, me and my friends, we made comic books in like grade school and stuff, and then in high school and college, I dabbled a little bit with Flash animation, would create cartoons and stuff. And I've just always kind of had an entrepreneur spirit to me. I've known long-term goals. I didn't want to be working a 9 to 5. I wanted to own my own business. And that's part of the reason that when I went to school at EKU, I majored in accounting.
Yeah.
Because I knew I wanted to be around business. I figured, at least with accounting, I could get a practical skill set, rather than a general business degree.
Something to fall back on. I think it's the way I think the entrepreneur's like, well, yeah, I want to be entrepreneurial, but also don't want to be stupid at the same time.
Broke, yeah.
And you got to have a little of both in some respects there. Calculated risk, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. Which, CPAs like to do, so.
Do they? I don't know. It seems like a little bit of an oxymoron there. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's what you calculate the risk.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There we go.
Maximize that reward,
That's right. You know what? I'm surprised there's not more CPAs that I meet that aren't already real estate investors. I would think they would be the ones that see the opportunity the most a lot of times.
You would be surprised, though. The ones that are investors, hold on to those, work with those, because you really don't learn like the secrets to this stuff when you take the exam or go into school. You just kind of go through the motions, and sometimes it's more like sometimes CPAs can operate from kind of a mindset of, well, I know if I don't take a risk and provide this advice, then this is at least safe. So sometimes it can be that. What you need that too. You kind of need a balance, but that's why I recommend talking to a number of professionals, and you find somebody that you work well with.
Yeah, and I think with CPAs can be one, finding somebody that works a lot with real estate investors or in your specific niche, but. A CPA that knows what they're doing in the real estate side can be such a huge value compared to just kind of your generalist CPA personnel or something like that, I would assume, right?
Oh, absolutely, okay. Yeah.
I thought that would be the case, but I don't want to jump to conclusions there. But So cool. So when was it that you kind of jumped into the real estate side of things from the entrepreneurial space, though? How many years ago has that been?
It was really 2020 when I made the leap. It's something I'd thought about for a long time before, and Airbnb specifically was something that interested me, as well as long-term rentals. But I really made the leap when I finally bought my single-family home and started with house hacking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've talked a little bit about house hacking on here, and obviously, just how easy of a way. I mean, there's nothing easy about buying real estate sometimes, or getting across that first initial threshold of buying your first rental or for your first single family home type of scenario. But with that being said, there's a lot to the fact that you can. Once you kind of get in through that door, that's sometimes one of the easiest doors to kind of get through as far as I talk a lot of, that's what I tell young people all the time, you just got to house hack or find something where you can rent out part of your basement or, something. And it can go such a long way. But then you kind of jumped into, obviously, like I said, the arbitrage method, which I assume you were listening to other podcasts or doing a lot of research on YouTube or something like that, because that's not a common term. I don't think I would even go as far as to say that I don't know if there's I'd be curious about how many real estate investors themselves even know that term kind of a scenario. But for those that don't know what that means, why don't you kind of dive into a little bit what that definition is and what that looks like or what that is? Yeah,
so arbitrage is essentially using someone else's property to run your rental business. It's basically what you do is you rent an apartment long-term like you normally would, except you have an established relationship with the landlord where you get a sublease addendum, typically is how it's done, or you do it on a corporate lease with a sublease addendum. And that allows you to legally furnish the place, re-rent it as a sublet, to people on a short-term basis.
And so that obviously would only truly work if it was probably a midterm rental scenario or a short-term rental, midterm being 30 days or longer, short-term being less than 30 days scenarios, because obviously if you're just renting it at a long-term rate, there's no sense of arbitraging a long-term tenant, because I think you'd be losing money at that point probably in that sense. But
for the most part, there is some caveats to that. I have you do encounter some people that they just have trouble getting approved for a regular apartment. But someone like me can come in as a middleman, and I don't really particularly do as much of this version of it, but I've met operators who do.
Really?
And you can step in and basically you get all the approval and stuff. It's all based off your business. And then you're able to kind of set your own guidelines for how you rent. And you might have people that, especially in the gig economy, people that are a lot of cash heavy. And, they aren't able to qualify, with the typical, parameters for renting at the place. So you do get some people I've worked with, other operators, they have people that move in and it'll be furnished, and sometimes not. And they'll rent sometimes for even long term.
Interesting.
But that's kind of a unique, So primarily, you're right, though. Usually it's going to be like short-term or mid-term type stays.
Right. And in some respects, when you're first starting out investing, so one, you got I would say, let's start with the downsides. Downsides, I assume, would be the fact that, one, you're now tied to a lease agreement that you're obligated to pay or pay a penalty to kind of back out of that agreement of some sort, usually a 12-month or longer. So there's kind of some inherent risk in that respects. But outside of that, really, there's no true risk from outside of that standpoint, right? Whereas the upside, correct me if I'm wrong, would be obviously the fact that you are now able to cash flow pretty heavily because you're now assuming that the market works where with the mid or short-term rental side of things, you're able to cash flow positive above and beyond that without actually ever really owning the real estate to begin with, and start actually producing a cash flowing entity to be able to leverage and then use maybe to buy long-term assets or something like that.
Right.
Do I kind of break that down correctly there?
Yeah.
Anything to add to that? Or
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's a great entry space to real estate, or even like a second, step in real estate. You can't beat house hacking to start.
No.
Like going back just for a minute to like my story and how I started this. In 2020, I bought my first house, and then a month or so into that, I ended up losing my job. Due to the pandemic, because at the time I worked for a small business.
Yeah.
I was doing all their finances and stuff.
Yeah.
And but they were in international study abroad program. That was what they did.
Oh.
And so it completely killed it. For a while we fought it, brief pause, but then it became clear that funds were drying up quickly.
Yeah.
So I knew myself, I started to see it, and it's like, okay, well, now I've just bought this house, so I better be able to pivot.
If it's not one thing that I feel like there was more, it feels like the amount of entrepreneurs that were created out of the pandemic were,
oh yeah,
just the fact that I think so many people, and I started my business before then, in 2019, as far as when I opened my own doors to my own business, but I'm so glad I did, but yeah, it's like, if anything, it made people realize, hey, I'd rather be in charge of my own destiny here and not at the mercy of someone else, which is fine if people have that, or, if you're a spouse, one of you's not tied to that and one is, there's some benefits there tax-wise too, to sometimes being in real estate and having that against the W-2 like we've talked about. But as far as that, I mean, yeah, so you got your risk, obviously, of being tied into kind of a lease in that respect, but really the upside from there, I mean, there's really just an infinite amount of upside as far as being able to scale that thing. And so that's one of the parts about creating a cash flowing business is you are able to probably pretty quickly scale from nothing to several doors. So now you have how many doors now?
With the partnership, we're up to 16 doors.
16 doors, and that's been roughly in the matter of just a couple of years, I assume, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, talk about that, just the fact of like scaling. I assume once you kind of get into it, your feet wet, figuring it out, really it's just a matter of like doing as much as you want in some respects within reason. Yeah,
I mean, you don't have to deal with financing. Like, that's not even a question. It's just once you, so that's not a barrier. Whereas like regular real estate, you do the BRRRR method or you do different things. Because you have to meet that financing. But with this, it's nobody's going to step in and say you can't take on another lease an apartment.
Yeah.
Nobody's monitoring that. Nobody cares. I mean, as long as you're paying rent,
right?
That's what it is. So it's incredibly quick to scale. You have a lot of exit strategies. Like you said, I mean, the downside is, you're on one long-term lease. So at the end of the day, if you're doing more short-term, or if you're doing more mid-term, you pivot to short-term or vice versa. Or if you had to, you switch to a long-term for a while and ride it out and get out of the lease. So
that's a good point. I never thought about that.
Yeah, and I mean, chances are you're in a market where rents have probably gone up anyway, so you might be able to get a little skim there. You just just ride it out and get out of the lease.
Consider that, but like, hey, I got 6 more months and I want to end it. That's a great point too. Interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, I wonder, in some respects, I guess if you're the entity and you're renting it out, that would be one thing you could do that, because obviously legally you can't do a legal contract for someone else. So that would still work in those parameters, because you can't do a legal contract in a lot of ways without owning the property or having the rights to rent out that property to consumer. So
the caveat is you're doing it the correct way to begin with. Which unfortunately there are a lot of people that aren't, but you don't want to just do it on a regular residential lease. That's why when I explained arbitrage, the sublease addendum is very important. You want to make sure you have one of those, have that in place. And
because there are a lot of caveats to that in the sense that it's saying that you as the are doing the managing. I mean, and you are now renting it out and leasing it out. It'd be a different story if you're renting it and then you have a third party company or somebody trying to manage that. That would probably break a lot of those foundational parameters that are put into those subleases to begin with, I imagine.
It all depends how you have it structured and everything, So
I assume it would be a lot harder to do it that way, because I don't think someone would want to rent out their property to a sublease only to then have another third party start managing that sublease as well. Let's transition to that then. I mean, as far as that goes, we talked a little bit about that a while back off air, me and you, where I could see that sometimes being a bit of a barrier, but I think you had mentioned you didn't think that was as big a barrier as I think people think when it comes to finding the right people who are willing to sublease these for the acquisition, the purpose of arbitraging the properties. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's totally correct. And you know, most people, when you talk about this for the first time, they kind of react the same way you do. It's, you know, it's just they're kind of shocked. And they find it hard to believe that any landlord would allow it. You know, once you have the pitch down and you know the benefits of it, and you can explain how it works to a landlord, you'd be really surprised how quickly that they're not only into doing it, but also even like excited about it.
Yeah,
like enthusiastic about working with you.
Some of the other barriers within, because like you talked about, there's different pivot points. Because obviously, there's a lot of legal aspects around the idea of short-term leases, specifically short-term leasing. STRs, as we like to call them, Airbnb and so forth, within cities around the country and so forth. Obviously, even several of the cities in Kentucky, especially Louisville, Lexington's working on it type of thing as far as what that looks like, guidelines, having to have permits for different stuff like that. So what has been your kind of expertise as far as from research and so forth, as far as how to kind of go about looking to see if those parameters fit within either cities locally or around it? Obviously, sometimes you probably get around it being if it was a midterm, there's 30 days or longer. That sometimes can be an option around it type of thing if you have to have a permit. So dive into that a little bit as far as that goes.
Yeah, so if you're planning to do it, you want to definitely research the area. You know, and you can start with just a simple Google search to just get an idea of what the regulation looks like. But then ultimately, what you want to do is to actually call the county clerk and, you know, actually review the ordinances and, you know,
just go straight to the source.
Yeah, just go straight to the source, and you can find out, you know, what the regulations are, and if there's any zoning, you can learn about that, and that gives you kind of a roadmap where to start, where to look. And
now, the other part with the property manager, I wanted to come before we get too far beyond that, and obviously the regulations is, I assume then that also usually means one of those hurdles we talked about is you kind of have to be. Typically, when I'm renting someplace, they're giving me a key to the front door, so to speak, right? And so, but this case, obviously, it's a unique where they have to kind of be comfortable with changing the locks, and I assume that encompasses, you know, giving them access to that new lock that you're now putting on the door if you're in those senses. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the way we do it, we always get the landlord's permission to switch out the locks, and we try to always use, whenever we can, we try to use the deadbolts with a keypad on them. Yep. You know, so it's keyless entry. Yeah. And guests can come and go, and it's really easy. And so we give the landlord a code, and typically sometimes they'll have backup, you know, keys as well. So yeah.
So there's usually not much of a fight put up with that once they've kind of gotten over the initial thought process behind it all.
I mean, all landlords are different, but typically when you find one that's interested in doing this, that's typically not a sticking point.
Now, do you find it's usually you find more success working directly with a property owner that's self-managing these, or do you also find it just as easy to work with a, you know, larger apartment complexes where there's an apartment manager of sort that obviously is just managing the complex or the real estate portfolio?
Yeah, we've done it both ways, and it really just depends on, you know, knowing your numbers when you go in the market and what works, and if you do the right, you know, if you have the right strategy, you can make both work. Yeah. Because we work with a lot of smaller landlords, but we also rent at some larger complexes. Yeah. And you'll kind of, you know, adjust your pitch according to that a little bit, and we found success with both ways.
I think you've talked about. We were talking about where if you find one, sometimes it's really easy to take one relationship that's become positive and roll that into multiple units or doors at that point, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the great thing is you work with a landlord, you know, if they have multiple doors, multiple places, you know, it's less headache for them too. It's like, wait, you're telling me I can talk to one person instead of 20, you know? Yeah. All right, let's do it, you know, so.
Interesting. Yeah. That is neat. Now, the other part with the short-term, midterm, and arbitrage method, obviously, you've got to furnish the place to begin with. The insurance, just from a little bit, can be a little bit tricky. It's a different policy. It's not expensive. It's just you just can't go get a standard State Farm policy or something like that. You had to kind of call us to kind of get those kind of workarounds and so forth. But I mean, what are some of the other benefits? Is there any tax benefits at all? I mean, I think that's taxed at a standard non-depreciating type of way, I would assume, right? I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're definitely going to want to structure your rental arbitrage in a way, your business in a way that helps you, advantages you when it comes to taxes. And so, like, what we do is, since we're doing arbitrage, we just try to keep it all passive. Yeah. So, because like you say, I mean, there's a huge benefit if you own real estate, then obviously to be able to depreciate it and all that, you want it as active income, and there's ways to do that. But since it's just going to be arbitrage, that's part of the reason why we do kind of a hybrid model where we do short-term and midterm, because those midterm stays are going to up your average nightly stay above 7. Okay. And then at which point, for tax purposes, it just becomes like passive long-term rent. And so
now, if you wanted to, I mean, would there be methods to just define that as being a full-time real estate investor kind of scenario? If you wanted to structure it that way, I mean, some flexibility to go either or.
If you
had like long-term entities or a W-2 to kind of or some depreciation on another entity kind of a thing within your household.
Right. So then it could count, towards your hours to become a real estate professional, which then could allow you this other stuff in your portfolio, that you're trying to depreciate. It could help you from that.
Ultimately, the hours is also dependent upon you spending more time in there than anyone else working in that kind of business to an extent.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. That's what I was thinking. Obviously, that's why I'm like, why are there not more CPAs or tax professionals that invest in their own real estate themselves? So you're paving a new way there, Daniel. No, but you've had a lot of success as well. Researching other areas. Even out. Obviously, you've got some here in Kentucky, but even outside of that. And so, talk to me about what kind of led you to that, or kind of how to go about researching or doing some of that to kind of figure out other areas of country to kind of do the same thing, and then also how that kind of came about as far as getting it set up and running it remotely.
So we have some out of state, and if you're trying to find something out of state, there's several ways you can do that. First, go back to look for some areas where you expect short-term or mid-term rentals to do well. Mm-hmm. And then basically what you're going to want to do is you can actually just search Airbnb. You can actually see where other, properties are at. You can find apartment complexes that allow it because they're on there. And then you call them directly, and then you'll find out if they actually allow it or not,
Right.
And then that's, and that's how you can start that process. Other things you can do is be active on Facebook groups. That's actually how I ended up finding these deals down in Texas, the first ones we took. I was on a Facebook group where they routinely post, it's almost like wholesaling for leases. There's like people that legit will sell leads.
So this is a group that was specific to arbitraging then?
Yes, it was specifically around arbitrage.
Why would the person be on there wanting to kind of, whatever term you just used there, but resell leases kind of a scenario?
Yeah, well, it's really just like a referral fee.
Yeah.
Basically, so they basically have.
It's amazing what you can make money at. Then that's because like that never crossed my mind. Like, who's thinking of like I'm going to resell? I mean, contracts to buying a property. I got that one, but then the fact that you're just doing that for leases as well is kind of mind blowing to me.
Yeah, and and I definitely don't necessarily recommend doing that for your first one because you kind of want to know what you're doing. Yeah, there are a lot of scams on those boards, and typically 9 out of 10, like I'll see stuff that interests me, and most of them it goes nowhere. So the best way to start really is, like I say, know your numbers, do AirDNA, Wheelhouse, and then learn the regulations, know the area where you can do it. And, you can you can take a trip down there, drive the area. You know, you can find smaller property owners by just houses. You know,
just drive-bys and
just signs and you know, you can start calling people. But also, like I said, Airbnb, Facebook Marketplace is another one. You know.
Well, now, what is your strategy as far as when you're kind of building these plans to present to the, or as far as your own personal plans on the other side, for what that profit margin needs to either be or look like, either as percentage or it's a set amount, and is that factoring in both the rent and the expenses between cable and maintenance or anything like that, or what are some of those numbers and percentages look like typically for you all?
Yeah, so for us to do midterm in an area, which just going back, those 30-day plus days, we typically, if we're going to arbitrage something, we want to make sure we can at least get $800 to $1,000 a month.
On top of after expenses and rent.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what we kind of look for. And, you know, as far as the cost of furnishing the place, if you're looking at, like, we do a lot of like 1-bedroom places. If you're looking at a 1-bedroom, if you're trying to do pure STR short-term rental, you're probably looking at $3,500 to $4,000.
Okay.
And then if you're looking at something more kind of hybrid, like I do, which is a mixture of both midterm and short-term, we're looking around $2,500 to $3,000. You know, is what we try to spend.
That,
one bedroom
type place.
And we try to have it basically set up to where we pay off the furniture in 3 to 5 months, somewhere in that range.
3 to 5 months. Because I've heard on the STR side of things, especially more the people that do like the luxury listing scenarios, they're usually more at, you know, $10,000 per like 1,000 square feet or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. If you try to go,
you know, in this case, you're not necessarily trying to be that full immersive experience. You're just almost treating it more like a true hotel scenario in this sense versus experience scenario, which there's methods to different directions, and depending on how you want to structure that and what your audience or client base or customers would be.
Exactly. And, you know, if you're doing more pure play short-term rental, you're typically thinking like vacation rental.
Yeah.
And that's typically your furnishings. If you're doing luxury or something like that, it is going to be pricier. But the ways you can kind of keep those costs down too is, you know, we don't buy anything new.
Yeah.
We go, the stuff we do buy new, we get good deals on, you know.
Right.
But, you know, we do a lot of Facebook Marketplace.
Sure.
Find stuff on Facebook Marketplace. You know, yard sales even. Sometimes you can find, you know. So there's ways to kind of keep your budget pretty low. And if you're trying to do a hybrid model like we are, the midterms you really don't want a ton of extra stuff. Like, you don't need a ton of fluff or decor, because some of these people, they're coming, they're going to be there a while. They bring their own stuff, and it's just in the way. Yeah. So when you're trying to do both, you can get by with a lower cost.
And in some ways, I think there could be some advantages too, where, like, if it's an apartment place or condo scenario where there might have like a communal, say, washer and dryer area where you're not having to worry about providing that or worry about the hookups causing leaks or whatnot. Like, most investors have probably had an issue with water leaking because of a washer dryer connection or them not making the correct connection the correct way and so forth, right?
Yeah. Which, I mean, it reminds me, that's another advantage to doing this, especially as like a first or second venture, is, you know, you can kind of be around the real estate world without necessarily having to be handy.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you rent from apartment complex and they have on-site maintenance, and you'll also make relationships with vendors that you can get out there if you need to. And, you know, so a lot of that stuff that it can kind of be a headache, you get a little bit of it. It's like a perfect little taste, but not nearly as much.
I imagine if you go into a market like we talked about that's remote, where it would take you a day's drive. You know, some of yours I know are like a full day's drive, if not more, to get to. Is that where, I guess, we're really relying on local contractors or cleaners or something like that? Becomes it handy? Have you had any issues with that, or any pointers to kind of talk about that in that respect, as far as, you know, you got to kind of have a local team in some respects there, right?
Yeah, definitely. When you're doing this, you'll definitely want to build a team. Your cleaner is going to be your most important person. They're kind of like your eyes
to the ground.
Exactly. And you also kind of want somebody who can be just like a runner, and that could also be the cleaner, or somebody who can do quality control, kind of follows in after the cleaner. So that way you're going to make sure that, you're not just trusting one person to make sure that everything's good. You kind of build a process and put a system in place so that you can give a consistent product.
Yeah.
And the last one would be like a handyman.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, especially if you're just taking on one or two places, trying to manage it remotely, you will lean heavily on apps like TaskRabbit, Thumbtack. There's
TaskRabbit. What was the other one?
I think it's Thumbtack.
Thumbtack.
I might be. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is Thumbtack. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thumbtack,
So it's like TaskRabbit. You can find like contractors basically.
And so
people that do
through there like that. Interesting. I'm not familiar with those.
Yeah.
The other part with the maintenance side, the question with that in that regards, like how is that working in the sublease scenario? Is it that you're saying, hey, I'm also going to take on these specific things if something goes wrong, or is that something you're leaning on, hey, like a traditional long-term tenant that, we deal with, like you're calling the landlord that actually owns the building to take care of? Like is it a mixture of both? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it'll depend, based on the individual scenario, but it's usually like a mixture of both because, you're not, every little small thing that comes up, obviously if you need a P-trap cleaned out or something, you're just going to do that yourself or have somebody do it.
Yeah.
So little things like that, and that's part of the pitch too, when we go to landlords, it's like, we're a little less of a headache because it's kind of like you're renting to a property management company.
Get more guarantee and less like stress of what things you might have to deal with.
Yeah. And, so when major stuff comes up, obviously we have to reach out to them.
Sure.
But little stuff, we can typically take care of it ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes, it just depends too. If you're renting to a midterm, they might be more lenient. It's like, hey, we're going to have somebody out there in a few days. Whereas if somebody's there for a single night and something goes wrong, you might not be able to wait on the landlord to fix it.
Yeah.
Because it's your business at the end of the day. So
that's a great point. And your business is you're tied to your name, and that's all that matters, especially when you're looking for Facebook reviews or Google reviews, or more importantly, the Airbnb reviews and stuff like that, obviously. So, and now are you all using Furnished Finder for when you do the midterms? That's still kind of the go-to for midterm rental side of things? Yeah,
it's a great entryway space, and the budgets on that are coming down a little bit as we kind of exit the pandemic completely.
Okay.
Some of the travel nursing stipends have gone down some, but it's still a great go-to, and it's great for starting out for sure. Yeah.
Well, good. Anything else to point out with it, or any thoughts or expertise on something that's not coming to my mind, obviously, in that sense, that you wanted to kind of point out at all?
One little tip I would just say for if you are trying to do kind of a hybrid model of doing midterm and short-term rentals, pricing is going to be key. Making sure you understand how to dynamically price your rentals so that you're trying to get most of your bookings to occur within a certain,
What's the main one for dynamic pricing that most people use again?
There's Wheelhouse, Price Labs.
Price Labs is what I'm thinking of, I think.
But you can also learn to do it yourself. And
if you love the numbers and calculations, So which one do you use? Do you use Price Labs or?
So what I do is I use Wheelhouse, and I haven't started actually a paid subscription yet.
Yeah.
The cool thing about Wheelhouse is that you can build these. This is actually a really cool tip. You can build these. What do they call it? It's like a fake listing almost, and you put in your address and you put in some of the parameters of what amenities it has and stuff.
Yeah.
And it will kind of give you what the pricing would look like if you subscribed.
Really?
And you can actually take that and then build it into your pricing. You can manually do it. It takes time, and it's a pain, but it can be done. And if you check it weekly or every couple of weeks, you can stay on top of that, and without paying any extra fee, you can be priced better than probably 90% of the competition that isn't doing any kind of.
Interesting. Hey, a lot of good stuff and thoughts there. I got my wheels turning for sure. And I know, like I said, it's kind of a scary concept because, I think in some ways it's kind of both. Sometimes in some ways it's not scary because you're not having to tie yourself to, bank loans, liens, and so forth. But now you're on the hook for rent. And so I think just being mindful of that and not spreading yourself too thin and growing at a consistent but not too fast of a pace would be recommended if someone wants to go down this path.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think you nailed it.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, appreciate you coming on the show today. There's a lot of great insight. Again, what was the @ handle for your current properties on Instagram and so forth?
My handle is @ShortStayCPA, and our partnership is called Furnished by Friends, and that's Facebook.com/Furnished by Friends.
Perfect. Appreciate you coming on the show, and we will check everybody back next week for another Keys to the Commonwealth episode. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.
To learn more about this podcast, visit our page at keystothecommonwealth.com. To connect with Landry regarding insuring your investment portfolio, email Landry at novainsuranceGroup.com or call 859-687-2004.